everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're doing things a little differently. We're diving into the world of statistics, but don't worry, we're not going to be like crunching numbers or anything like that. We're going to be talking about sampling. Think of it as like the art of making educated guesses about a huge group of things, people, or anything really, just by looking at a smaller part of it. You know how like people are always conducting polls and surveys, or how about those medical studies you hear about?
Right.
They all rely on sampling. And understanding how it works can be surprisingly useful in like your own life, you know? It's like having a superpower that helps you see through misleading statistics and make smarter decisions. And to help us unpack all of this, we have an expert joining us today. Welcome.
It's great to be here.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly is sampling and why is it so important?
So imagine you want to know the average height of everyone in the entire country.
Hmm.
You can't possibly measure every single person, right? That's where sampling comes in. Instead of measuring everyone, you could select a smaller group. It's called a sample. That is representative of the entire population. And if you choose your sample carefully, you can use the data from that smaller group to make surprisingly accurate inferences about the entire population.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do you make sure your sample is actually representative of the whole group? I mean, what if you accidentally end up with a group of unusually tall people in your sample? Wouldn't that throw off your results?
That's a great question. And it gets at the heart of why choosing the right sampling method is so important. There are a bunch of different techniques, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. And the key is to pick the one that's most likely to give you a sample that accurately reflects the characteristics of the entire population.
So it's like having a toolbox full of different sampling tools, and you need to know which tool to use for which job.
Exactly. For instance, one of the most common techniques is called simple random sampling, or SRS. It's exactly what it sounds like. You randomly select individuals from the population, like pulling names out of a hat.
Okay.
With SRS, every single person or thing in the group has an equal chance of being included in the sample, which helps ensure that you're not introducing bias. Think of it like this. If you're trying to figure out the most popular ice cream flavor in a class of 30 kids, you wouldn't just ask the first 5 kids who walk in the door, right?
Right.
You'd want to find a way to get a random sample of kids from across the class to make sure your results are accurate.
Right. Because the first 5 kids might all be chocolate lovers, and then you'd have a very skewed view of the class's preferences. So SRS is all about randomness. But what if you don't have a hat big enough to fit the entire population?
Well, luckily we don't have to rely on giant hats these days.
Yeah.
We have computers and random number generators that can do the job much more efficiently, even for huge populations.
That makes sense. So simple random sampling seems pretty straightforward. What are some other techniques researchers use?
Let's talk about systematic sampling. This technique involves selecting individuals at regular intervals. For example, you might decide to survey every 5th person who walks into a store or analyze every 10th product that comes off a production line.
That sounds pretty easy to implement, kind of like a built-in system for choosing your sample.
Exactly. And it can be quite effective, especially in settings where you have a continuous flow of individuals or items. But there's a potential pitfall to watch out for: hidden patterns in the data.
Hidden patterns? What do you mean?
Imagine you're using systematic sampling to check the quality products coming off an assembly line. If there's a faulty piece of equipment that causes a defect in every 12th product, and you happen to be sampling every 6th product,
You might completely miss the defect. Or you might think the defect rate is much higher than it actually is. That's a really good point. Systematic sampling might seem simple, but you need to understand your data well to avoid these hidden patterns. Are there any other common sampling techniques?
Absolutely. Let's talk about stratified sampling. This technique is particularly useful when you have a diverse population, and you want to make sure that all the different subgroups are represented in your sample.
So instead of just randomly selecting people from the entire population, you divide them into groups first.
Exactly. You divide the population into groups called strata, based on characteristics that are relevant to your research. For example, if you're studying eating habits, you might stratify your sample by age, gender, or even dietary preferences.
That makes sense. You wouldn't want your entire sample to be made up of college students if you're trying to understand the eating habits of the general population.
Exactly. And once you've divided your population into strata, you randomly select individuals from within each stratum to ensure that all the subgroups are proportionally represented in your final sample.
So if you're studying a population that's 60% female and 40% male, your final sample would ideally reflect those same proportions.
Exactly. Stratified sampling helps to reduce sampling bias and increase the accuracy of your results, especially when dealing with diverse populations.
Stratified sampling sounds like a powerful technique. I can see how it would be really helpful in a lot of different research scenarios. But what about situations where you're dealing with a massive geographically dispersed population, like if you wanted to study the bird migration patterns across an entire continent, for example? Randomly selecting birds from such a wide area would be incredibly difficult and time-consuming, wouldn't it?
You're absolutely right. That's where cluster sampling comes in handy. It's a technique that allows you to sample data from a large, spread-out population in a more manageable way. Instead of trying to sample randomly from the entire population, which could involve traveling to countless locations, you divide the population into groups or clusters.
So in the case of the bird migration study, the clusters might be different geographic regions or maybe even different types of habitats.
Precisely. And once you've defined your clusters, you randomly select a certain number of clusters and then collect data from every single individual within those selected clusters.
So instead of trying to catch birds all over the continent, you might randomly choose 5 different forests and focus your sampling efforts within those forests.
Exactly. And the key here is that by randomly selecting the clusters, you're still introducing a degree of randomness into your sampling process, even though you're not sampling from the entire population.
That's really interesting. So cluster sampling is kind of like a more practical version of simple random sampling for when you're dealing with large spread out populations.
You got it. But just like all sampling techniques, there are potential drawbacks to be aware of. For example, it's important to make sure that the clusters themselves are not systematically different from each other in a way that could bias your results.
That makes sense. You wouldn't want to choose 5 forests that are all located in areas with unusually high levels of pollution, for example, because that might skew your data on bird migration patterns.
Exactly. You want your clusters to be as representative of the overall population as possible, even though you're only sampling from a subset of them.
Cluster sampling sounds like a really valuable technique, especially for researchers working in fields like ecology, environmental science, or anything that involves studying large, geographically dispersed populations. So we've covered simple random sampling, systematic sampling, stratified sampling, and cluster sampling. What other tools are in our sampling toolbox?
Well, let's talk about a technique that's often used when researchers need to ensure they have a specific number of participants from different subgroups, even if those subgroups aren't evenly represented in the population. Quota sampling.
Quota sampling. I'm not familiar with that one. Tell me more.
Imagine you're conducting a study on consumer preferences for a new product, and you want to make sure you get feedback from an equal number of men and women. But you also know that women tend to be more likely to purchase this particular type of product.
So if you just did a simple random sample, you might end up with a disproportionate number of women in your study, even if men's opinions are equally valuable for your research.
Precisely. With quota sampling, you essentially set quotas for each subgroup. So you might decide that you want to interview 100 men and 100 women, even though you know that women might make up a larger proportion of the overall population of potential customers for this product.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this could be useful. So you're essentially controlling for certain demographic factors to make sure your sample is balanced in a way that reflects your research goals, even if it doesn't perfectly match the population distribution.
You've got it. It can be a valuable tool, especially when you're working with limited resources or tight deadlines.
It sounds like quota sampling could be really helpful for market research, opinion polls, and that kind of thing. But are there any potential downsides? I mean, it seems like you might be introducing some bias by specifically seeking out certain types of participants, right?
That's a great point, and it's one of the main criticisms of quota sampling. While it can be a quick and convenient way to gather data, it does have the potential to introduce bias because the selection of participants within each subgroup is not random.
Okay, I see. So if you're doing a study on, say, opinions about a new city park, and you set quotas for different age groups, you might end up with a sample that overrepresents people who are already inclined to use parks, simply because you're more likely to find them at the park in the first place.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to be aware of the potential for bias when using quota sampling. Researchers need to carefully consider the potential sources of bias and interpret their results accordingly.
So it's a useful tool, but one that should be used with caution. I'm starting to realize that there's a lot more to sampling than I initially realized. Are there any other techniques we should cover?
Yes. There's one more technique that's worth mentioning, especially since it's often used in fields like ecology and wildlife biology, where it can be difficult or even impossible to count every single individual in a population. Capture, recapture.
Capture, recapture. That sounds intriguing. Tell me more.
Imagine you're trying to estimate the size of a fish population in a lake. It'd be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to catch and count every single fish.
Yeah. You'd be lucky to catch a cold, let alone every fish in the lake.
Exactly. So with capture, recapture, you take a sample of the population, tag those individuals in some way, and then release them back into the wild. Then, after a period of time has passed, you go back and capture another sample.
And you see how many of the tagged individuals you're able to recapture in that second sample.
You got it. By looking at the proportion of tagged individuals in the second sample, you can actually estimate the size of the total population using a specific formula.
Wow, that's fascinating. So you're using a smaller, more manageable sample to make inferences about the size of a much larger population.
Exactly. And this technique isn't just used for fish populations. It can be applied to a wide range of situations, from estimating the number of homeless individuals in a city to tracking the movement of insects.
That's incredible. I never would have guessed that you could use sampling techniques to estimate the size of a population that you can't even see in its entirety. This is blowing my mind. I'm starting to see sampling everywhere I look. But before we get carried away, let's take a quick pause here. When we come back, we'll delve into some real-world examples of sampling in action and explore why understanding these techniques is so crucial for navigating our increasingly data-driven world. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Before the break, we were diving deep into the fascinating world of sampling techniques, and I have to say, my brain is already doing some serious statistical acrobatics.
It's amazing how much complexity lies beneath the surface of something as seemingly simple as choosing a sample, isn't it?
It really is. And speaking of complexity, you mentioned that there are even more nuances within each of these sampling techniques, right? I'm all ears. Let's unpack some of those finer details.
Let's start with simple random sampling, or SRS, since it's often considered the gold standard of sampling. While it's true that every individual in the population has an equal chance of being selected with SRS, there are still variations in how you go about actually selecting those individuals.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So beyond just using a random number generator, what other ways are there to create a truly random sample?
Well, one classic method, though not as practical for large populations, is something called lottery sampling. Imagine writing every single name on a slip of paper, tossing those slips into a giant hat, and then drawing out your sample one by one.
I can picture it a giant spinning drum full of lottery balls, except instead of numbers, it's people's names. That would be pretty cool to witness. But I can see how it would get logistically challenging for anything beyond a relatively small group.
Exactly. That's why random number generators are the go-to method these days. They eliminate the need for giant hats and lottery balls and can handle massive data sets with ease.
Technology to the rescue, as always. But even with random number generators, aren't there still decisions to be made about how to use them effectively? Like, do you number the individuals in a specific order or just assign numbers randomly?
You're absolutely right. Those details matter. And it highlights a really important point about sampling. It's not just about blindly following a formula. It's about understanding the nuances of your data and making informed choices at every step of the process.
So even with something as seemingly straightforward as SRS, there's a certain art to it, a need for careful consideration and a deep understanding of the data. What about systematic sampling? Any hidden depths there?
With systematic sampling, it's all about the interval, that nth value that determines who gets included in your sample. Choosing the right interval is crucial, not only to ensure that you're capturing a representative slice of your data, but also to avoid introducing bias.
We talked earlier about the risk of hidden patterns in the data. Like if you're sampling every 10th product coming off a production line, and there happens to be a defect in every 10th product, what are some other things researchers need to consider when choosing an interval for systematic sampling?
Well, one factor that often gets overlooked is the starting point. If you always start with the very first individual on your list, and your interval happens to align with some underlying pattern in the data, you could end up with a biased sample.
So even if your interval itself is fine, the starting point can throw things off.
Exactly. Let's say you're surveying people leaving a concert hall to get their opinions on the performance. If you decide to interview every 10th person, and you just happen to start with someone who absolutely loved the show,
you might end up with a sample that's overly positive, because you're more likely to encounter groups of friends leaving together, and they might share similar opinions.
Exactly. That's why it's often a good idea to randomize the starting point in systematic sampling. Instead of always starting with the first person or item, You randomly select a starting point within the first interval, and then you continue sampling at your chosen interval from there.
So a little bit of randomness can go a long way in reducing bias, even within a technique that's based on a systematic approach. That makes a lot of sense. What about stratified sampling? Any nuances we should explore there?
With stratified sampling, one of the most critical decisions is how you define your strata in the first place. You want to choose characteristics that are not only relevant to your research question, but also effectively divide the population into distinct groups.
So going back to the example of studying eating habits, instead of just stratifying by age, you might also stratify by occupation or income level, since those factors can also influence people's diets.
Precisely. The more thoughtfully you define your strata, the more likely you are to end up with a sample that accurately reflects the complexity of the population you're studying.
It's like being a detective. You have to carefully examine all the clues and figure out which ones are most likely to lead you to the truth. And within each stratum, you're still using simple random sampling to select your participants, right?
Right. However, there's a specific variation of stratified sampling called proportionate stratified sampling. That's worth highlighting.
Proportionate stratified sampling? I sense a formula coming on. Tell me more.
With proportionate stratified sampling, you go a step further to ensure that the proportions of different subgroups in your sample closely match the proportions of those subgroups in the overall population.
So if you know that 20% of your target population lives in rural areas and 80% lives in urban areas, you would make sure those same proportions are reflected in your final sample.
Exactly. You would calculate the exact number of participants you need from each stratum to maintain those proportions. And then you would use simple random sampling within each stratum to select those participants. It requires a bit more calculation up front, but it can be a powerful way to ensure a truly representative sample.
Proportionate stratified sampling sounds like a great option for researchers who are working with really diverse populations and need to be extra careful about representation. What about cluster sampling? Any finer points we should delve into there?
One important thing to remember about cluster sampling is that clusters aren't always neatly defined geographic regions. They can be any type of naturally occurring group or grouping within your population.
Okay, so besides the bird migration study example, what are some other real-world scenarios where cluster sampling might come in handy?
Well, imagine you're conducting a study on student performance in a large school district. Instead of trying to randomly sample students from every single school in the district, which could be logistically challenging, you could use schools as your clusters.
So you might randomly select, say, 10 schools from the district, and then collect data from all the students within those selected schools.
Exactly. Or let's say you're a company doing market research, and you want to gather feedback from your customers about a new product. You could use cities as your clusters. Randomly select a certain number of cities, and then focus your marketing research efforts within those selected areas.
That makes a lot of sense. It's a way of simplifying the sampling process without sacrificing too much in terms of randomness or representation. But you did mention earlier that it's important to make sure that the clusters themselves aren't systematically different from each other in a way that could bias your results. What are some things researchers can do to mitigate that risk?
One strategy is to use a technique called multi-stage cluster sampling, where you essentially introduce multiple layers of randomness into the process.
Multi-stage cluster sampling. Multiple layers of randomness. I love it. Tell me more.
So, let's stick with the school district example. With multi-stage cluster sampling, instead of just randomly selecting 10 schools and calling it a day, you might first divide the district into smaller geographic zones.
Okay, so you're starting with a broader geographic division.
Exactly. Then, you would randomly select a certain number of those zones. And within each selected zone, you would randomly select a certain number of schools.
And then, within each selected school, you might even randomly select a certain number of classrooms to participate in your study.
You got it. By introducing multiple stages of random selection, you're essentially creating a sample that's less likely to be influenced by any pre-existing patterns or variations within the population.
Multi-stage cluster sampling. It's like a statistical safety net, catching all those potential biases before they can skew your data. I'm starting to think these sampling techniques should be taught in school. They're like essential life skills for navigating the world of information. Speaking of essential life skills, what about quota sampling? Any advanced techniques there?
Quota sampling can be particularly tricky because you're essentially balancing the desire for representation with the practicalities of data collection.
Right. You're trying to make sure your sample reflects certain demographic characteristics, even if it means sacrificing a bit of randomness. What are some things researchers can do to make sure they're using quota sampling responsibly and ethically?
One important consideration is how you go about selecting participants within each quota group. If you're simply relying on convenience sampling, like approaching people on the street, you're introducing a lot of potential for bias.
Because you're more likely to approach people who are already out and about, who are more approachable, or who fit a certain profile.
Exactly. To mitigate this, researchers can use a technique called stratified quota sampling, where they essentially combine elements of stratified sampling and quota sampling.
Okay, so instead of just setting overall quotas for, say, age and gender, you would create more specific subgroups within those categories.
Exactly. So instead of just aiming for 50 men and 50 women, you might create subgroups like men aged 18-24, women aged 25-34, and so on.
And then you would set quotas for each of those more specific subgroups based on their representation in the overall population.
Exactly. By creating these more granular subgroups, you're essentially reducing the amount of convenience sampling that occurs within each quota group, which can help to improve the representativeness of your final sample.
Stratified quota sampling. It's like quota sampling 2.0. It sounds like a good compromise between the efficiency of quota sampling and the rigor of stratified sampling. What about capture-recapture? Are there any advanced techniques or variations within that method?
Capture-recapture, while incredibly useful for certain types of populations, does come with its own set of challenges and assumptions.
Like what? I imagine that trying to catch and tag elusive creatures in the wild can't be easy.
You're right. It often involves a lot of fieldwork and logistical hurdles. And beyond the practical challenges, there are also statistical considerations. The accuracy of capture-recapture estimates depends heavily on a few key assumptions.
Okay, so what are some of those key assumptions?
One of the most important assumptions is that the marking or tagging method doesn't affect the animal's survival or their likelihood of being recaptured.
So you don't want to use a tag that's so big and bulky that it makes it harder for the animal to move around, or that makes them more visible to predators.
Exactly. If the tag makes the animal more or less likely to be recaptured, it will throw off your population estimates.
That makes sense. What are some other assumptions that researchers need to consider when using capture-recapture?
Another important assumption is that there's no immigration or emigration occurring within the population you're studying during the study period.
So you're assuming that the population is relatively closed off, at least for the duration of your study.
Exactly. If you're studying a population of birds, and a whole bunch of new birds migrate into the area after you've already tagged your initial sample, it will skew your results.
Right, because those new birds won't have been tagged, so they'll throw off the ratio of tagged to untagged individuals in your second sample.
You got it. And that's why researchers often try to choose study areas and study periods that are less likely to be affected by large-scale movements of individuals in and out of the population.
So capture-recapture, like all sampling techniques, requires a deep understanding of the nuances of your study system and a willingness to adapt your methods accordingly.
Absolutely. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to sampling. And the best technique will always depend on the specific research question, the characteristics of the population being studied, and the resources available.
This has been incredibly illuminating. I'm starting to see the world of data in a whole new light, with all its potential pitfalls and hidden complexities. But before we get too overwhelmed, let's take another quick break. When we come back, we'll explore some real-world examples of how sampling is used, and sometimes misused, in different fields. And we'll talk about why understanding these concepts is so crucial for navigating the increasingly data-driven world around us.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been on quite a journey, exploring the intricate world of sampling techniques, uncovering hidden layers of complexity, and discovering the subtle ways bias can creep into even the most carefully designed studies.
It's like we've been given a backstage pass to the world of data, peeking behind the curtain to see how the information we encounter every day is actually collected and analyzed.
Exactly. And I have to say, I'm both fascinated and a little bit terrified by what I'm learning. Fascinated by the power of sampling to help us understand the world around us, but also terrified by the potential for these techniques to be misused or misinterpreted. You've hit on a really important point. Understanding sampling isn't just about being able to rattle off definitions of different techniques. It's about developing a critical lens through which we can view the data and statistics that bombard us from all directions.
So it's like a BS detector for the data age.
Exactly. When you understand the principles of sampling, you're less likely to be swayed by misleading statistics or to draw faulty conclusions from poorly designed studies.
Okay, so let's put our newfound BS detectors to the test. What are some real-world scenarios where understanding sampling can help us become more informed consumers of information?
Well, one area where sampling plays a huge role, and where it's often misunderstood, is in political polling.
Right. Every election cycle, we're inundated with polls telling us who's ahead, who's behind, and which way the political winds are blowing. But how much faith should we actually put in those polls?
That's a great question. And the answer, unsurprisingly, depends on a number of factors, including how the poll was conducted, how large the sample size was, and what sampling methods were used.
So, it's not enough to just look at the headline results of a poll. We need to dig a little deeper to understand the methodology behind those numbers.
Exactly. Let's say you see a poll that says 55% of voters support a particular candidate. That might sound like a comfortable lead, but if the poll's margin of error is plus or minus 4 percentage points,
That means the actual level of support for that candidate could be anywhere from 51% to 59%, which could mean a much tighter race than the headline suggests.
exactly. And the margin of error is directly related to the sample size of the poll. The larger the sample size, the smaller the margin of error, and the more confident we can be in the results.
So a poll with a sample size of 1,000 people is going to be more reliable than a poll with a sample size of 100 people.
Generally speaking, yes, assuming both polls were conducted using sound sampling methods. But there's more to it than just sample size. If a poll uses a biased sampling method, even a large sample size won't save it.
So a poll that only surveys people who subscribe to a particular magazine or who live in a particular neighborhood might not be representative of the overall population, even if it has a large sample size.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to look for polls that use random sampling methods, like simple random sampling or stratified sampling. These methods help to ensure that everyone in the population has an equal chance of being selected, which reduces the potential for bias.
Okay, so next time I see a poll about an upcoming election, I'm going to put on my detective hat and do a little background check. I'll look for information about the sample size, the sampling methods used, and anything else that might give me clues about the reliability of the results. Are there other areas where understanding sampling can help us navigate the world of data?
Absolutely. Marketing research is another field where sampling reigns supreme. Companies are constantly trying to understand consumer preferences, test new products, and tailor their marketing campaigns to specific demographics. And they rely heavily on sampling to do all of this.
That makes sense. They can't ask every single person in the country what kind of toothpaste they prefer or what they think of a new advertising campaign.
Exactly. So they use sampling techniques to select smaller groups of consumers who are representative of their target markets.
So a company that's developing a new line of athletic wear might use stratified sampling to make sure they get feedback from people of different ages, genders, and activity levels.
Exactly. Or they might use cluster sampling to focus their research on specific geographic regions where they think their target market is concentrated.
And just like with political polling, the reliability of market research depends heavily on the quality of the sampling methods used.
Absolutely. A company that relies on convenience sampling, like approaching people at a shopping mall, might get very different results than a company that uses a more rigorous sampling method, like random digit dialing or online panels.
So as consumers, it's important for us to be aware of these different sampling methods and to be skeptical of marketing claims that are based on flimsy or biased data.
Absolutely. Don't believe everything you read on a product label or in an advertisement. Ask yourself, how did they arrive at those conclusions? What kind of research did they do? And who did they talk to?
Because a small, non-random sample of people who absolutely love a particular brand of laundry detergent does not a representative study make.
Exactly. And this critical thinking applies to all sorts of information we encounter, not just marketing claims. Think about medical studies, for example.
Okay, good point. You often hear about studies that show the benefits of a certain diet or exercise regimen, but how do you know if those studies were designed and conducted in a way that makes their results trustworthy?
That's where understanding sampling is crucial. A well-designed medical study will use random sampling methods to select participants and to assign those participants to different treatment groups.
So, if researchers are testing a new drug, they would randomly assign participants to either receive the drug or a placebo to make sure that any differences observed between the two groups are actually due to the drug itself and not to some other factor.
Exactly. Randomization is key in medical research because it helps to control for confounding variables, those pesky factors that can skew the results of a study if they're not accounted for.
So, if a study claims that people who eat a certain type of berry every day live longer, But the study didn't use random sampling. It's possible that the berry eaters were already healthier to begin with, or that they had other lifestyle factors that contributed to their longevity.
Exactly. Correlation does not equal causation, as the saying goes. Just because two things are correlated doesn't mean that one causes the other, and understanding sampling can help us tease apart these complex relationships and make more informed decisions about our health and well-being.
Wow. This has been eye-opening. I'm starting to see the world in a whole new light, with a newfound appreciation for the power and the potential pitfalls of sampling. Any final words of wisdom for our listeners before we wrap things up?
The next time you encounter a statistic, a survey result, or a research finding, don't just accept it at face value. Ask questions. Dig a little deeper. And remember, the more you understand about sampling, the better equipped you'll be to navigate our increasingly data-driven world.
Words to live by. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating world of sampling. I have a feeling I'll never look at a statistic the same way again. And to our listeners, thank you for being here. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Deep Dive. Until next time, stay curious.